Thinking about a few things and doing a couple of essential maintenance bits is going to help your bike run nice and smoothly, but also keep your pride and joy lasting you a bit longer, hopefully. Step number one in making your bike last a bit longer is actually to do a regular bolt check. Sounds crazy, but I've done this myself and seen it happen quite a few times where if you don't keep on top of this, things can come a bit loose and it can start wearing your bike out or even damaging them. I've seen rear axles come out on a ride before and that completely smashes the back end of the bike. It snaps the mech off. It can do loads of damage. So it's really important just to fairly regularly have a look at your bike. Sometimes I see, one of your linkage bolts, your pivot bolts might have backed off a bit and you can see a little gap. Obviously that means I haven't checked it often enough, but hopefully after a while you'll get a bit of a feel for what's coming loose on your bike and if actually something might need a bit of Loctite, particularly on pivot bearings on full suspension bikes. I've done that quite a few times where, maybe one of these bolts has a lot of rotation in there and they just find themselves coming loose a little bit. So I will go over, honestly takes you about 60 seconds to check the most important bolts. Won't necessarily check everything like brakes because they don't really come loose, but move your things, discs, caliper bolts, definitely full suspension and even crank bolts I'll check pretty regularly. Rear mechs do get bounced around a lot as well, so they can come loose. A nice selection of brushes are really going to help you get into your bike and clean it out. Also, it sort of helps you, especially if you've got a full suspension bike, getting into the linkage with a brush is going to save you firing too much water down into there, especially if you've got a pressure washer. Be careful about going straight at bearings. So I would go easy, use a brush instead, and then it won't take much pressure at all to get that mud off. Also, I'll keep a separate brush just for the drivetrain because that's going to get oily and I don't want to use that anywhere near my disc, so I'll use that around non-oily places and save one for just that mucky application where you don't want to get it on any other part of your bike. Washing your bike after muddy rides and also making sure that you're putting it away dry is going to extend the life of your bike by such a big margin. If you're just riding it, keeping it dirty and then riding it again, things will wear out. So I'll always make sure as well, once I've washed it, I've got a big old towel that I'll use to dry everything off. And then I'll sort of get into what needs doing next. So often in winter, if you're using the proper lube, so wet lube, it's got special ingredients in there, so it'll stick to your chain. So if you're riding through puddles, it doesn't get washed off like a dry lube will in summertime. Great for that, but in winter, especially in the UK, if you're riding somewhere really wet, then get some of that stuff on. But the problem with that is it is thicker and it will stick to your chain. And then if you don't clean your bike, it basically turns into grinding paste. You'll see if your chain gets really black. All that mud and grit and sand, whatever, that's sticking to your chain is then grinding into everything. So your cassette and your chain ring, and it's wearing them away, and that will wear your stuff out so much faster. So that's when it's time, in winter to get the degreaser out as well. So this is specially formulated to spray onto drivetrains. It's not gonna start ruining any other parts of your bike. It will get in there, it will get your old lube off, make it nice and clean, and that's when, again, I'll dry that chain out. Make sure the whole bike's dry and then I can start re-lubing it ready for the next ride. So once the bike is clean, it's time to lube it up. Like I said, picking the right chain lube for the choice of conditions. You've got dry, wet, or even all-weather chain lubricant. So that does a bit of everything. So that's quite an interesting one. Also, making sure that your suspension, so your shock and fork are nice and clean. Round the seals, I'll double check those. I'll normally get a rag and run it round here as well to make sure they are super clean. And then get some silicone spray. So this is stuff that I'll actually spray onto a rag and then go over the bike with a rag rather than spraying this too much on the bike. If you get this on your disc brakes, it ruins them. It'll stop them from working completely. Sometimes you can burn it off. I've done that quite a few times if you get a blowtorch. It's not great, or you probably need some disc brake cleaner as well, but it's obviously better just to not get it on there in the first place. So I'll get this on the frame, makes the bike super nice and shiny, but also make sure I'm getting this on the shock and the fork. It's gonna help them keep nice and smooth. Same as the chain. If they're dirty, you're just pushing dirt and grit up and down there, and they're expensive. You need to start replacing stanchions on your suspension. Where you keep your bike is also probably going to determine its life longevity a bit as well. So if you're lucky enough like me to have an indoor garage that's actually heated, it's great. Obviously I'll make sure my bike is dry, because if you're putting a wet bike into somewhere that's heated, it's going to get rusty really quick. But if you're keeping it outside in the shed, it's not ideal. I have had this before. I've got an outside garage and bikes have got a bit damp and it will start rusting up your chain in there. So hopefully you can keep your bike nice and dry and warm. If not, maybe worth thinking about covering it up so it doesn't get damp inside a garage. I guess this is something that you can't really alter, either you've got a nice garage or you haven't. But definitely, if you can keep it nice and dry and warm, your bike is going to last that little bit longer. So your chain and cassette are doing a lot of the dirty work on your bike. Obviously, you know, keeping on top of cleaning and lubing is great, but it's also worth checking it as well. I hate replacing drivetrains. It's like one of those things, it's expensive and your bike doesn't feel any different for doing it, but hopefully it'll shift a little better for anything. But what we can do is get a chain checker like this. So this will check how much your chain is stretched. So when they get worn out, they get super floppy, but they'll also stretch and get longer. And if they get too far, obviously it'll start slipping, and that's the time when you have to replace it all. So you'll need a chain and cassette and possibly even a chain ring as well. And that's when it gets expensive. So if you keep an eye on how much your chain is wearing, one of these checkers, it goes up to 0.5, and then if it gets worse, this goes in further and goes up to 0.75. But if you replace your chain at around the 0.5 mark, then a new chain will go onto the old cassette and it'll work. If it gets too worn up to the 0.75, you put a new chain on, it'll just slip on the old cassette anyway, so you have to then go down the more expensive route. So if you're replacing chains more regularly, then you won't have to replace a lot. So you probably get 2 or 3 chains per cassette. So just keep an eye on this. At the moment, I'm not even up to 0.5 yet. So this chain, although it looks a bit dirty, I need to clean it a bit. It's actually not worn at all yet, so I've got a decent amount of life left in this. Hopefully it'll last me all the rest of winter, because that's what I'll also do, is try and get it through the worst of winter, and then in summertime don't feel so bad about sticking a new drivetrain on. Tyres are expensive, so I always think about trying to get the most out of them. I'll use a rear one particularly until it's dying a death and the knobs are just completely worn down. But also I'll err on the side of having a slightly too tougher, heavier tyre. Just because if it's too light, you're gonna start ripping it if you're riding gnarly terrain. And then yes, you can repair them to a certain degree, but it'll also wear out quicker as well. So on my Nukeproof Giga, I've actually got a Vittoria Mazda Enduro build, so that's their toughest build on the rear. And then I've got a trail up front, save a bit of weight, and the front tyre doesn't take that much hammer. But on the rear, if I had a trail tyre, I'd end up pushing it pretty hard, possibly rip it, so I'd rather get my money's worth out of a slightly heavier tyre. Servicing your bike is obviously going to help it last longer, so make sure you've got a reasonably basic toolkit, and then you're going to need some lubricants and greases and things like that, because I'm going to start digging into the moving parts of my bike. So on a full suspension bike, definitely during winter, I will take the pivots off, have a look. You might feel that they're actually really smooth and they're dry in there because you've got really good seals now, or you've been super careful not washing it. You might find that you can start taking them apart, cleaning them out and re-greasing them to help them last a bit longer. Even getting a bit of grease sort of around the seals is going to stop water getting in there as well. So, any sort of enthusiastic mechanic can do this. You don't need to be sort of super into this and know exactly what you're doing. There's not much can go really wrong with the bike. What I would say is just trying to keep on top of that. Like I say, inspecting it fairly regularly is a way to know if it needs doing or not in the first place. And then things that I don't do, I will send off, are a suspension if I feel like that I need servicing. Also, there will be service intervals in these things. It's kind of worth looking into. Whereas, pivots, bearings, it's more about keeping an eye on yourself. These will have a number of hours, and then it's worth thinking about sending them off, getting serviced. The rest of it, keep on top of yourself, check out all your bearings, like your headset, your pivots, your wheel bearings, even your pedals are pretty easy to service yourself. In my experience on sort of modern bikes, these frame bearings should last you a year. So a summer and then a hard winter's riding, UK conditions. These ones still feel nice and smooth actually, so I'll just put a bit of grease around the outside to make sure they're a bit better sealed, and away I go. Top tip here, if you've got some of these little spacers that are kind of awkward to fit when you're putting it all back together, Use a bit of grease as glue and then it'll stick there, so you don't need 4 sets of hands to do one job. That doesn't feel tight enough. Prevention is always better than a cure. So if you've got a brand new bike, then it's worth thinking about getting a frame protection kit. So a lot of these are invisible, so you can't even tell your bike's got this thin film on there. You can stick it on a bike even though it's not brand new. You have to make sure you give it a really good clean, and obviously there might be some marks on it already, so you'll lose a bit of that. You'll get a bit scratched up before you put it on, but you can get these extra bits to go on cranks, on areas of cable rub. What I like to do on a fork, if I've stick one of these mud guards on with zip ties, these can actually scratch them up a little bit, so get a bit of electrical tape underneath there. It's going to save it. If you want to take it off in summertime, your fork's still going to look immaculate, so trying to stop it from getting scratched up is going to make it look new at least. Sort of lastly, I've found that a bike can get damaged more often than not in transport. So on the back of a car, in the van, if you're flying with them, make sure they're padded out with nice and soft. In the back of my van, I've got loads of blankets to cover it up in case I stick other bikes against it, because if you're scratching bikes, it doesn't look good, but also if you're scratching, you know, your fork leg, then that you might need to do a bit of work to that to repair it. So there's my tips for keeping your bike feeling longer and looking newer for longer, should I say. Also, I think if your bike is feeling a bit worn out, don't forget that putting a new set of tyres, grips, putting some new bearings in can make that bike feel like new anyway. So yeah, let me know if you've got any tips that you like to do, things you like to do to your bike to make it last a bit longer. And yeah, don't forget to subscribe to GMBN and head over to GMBN Tech if you want some more in-depth tips on how to service your bike.